A 3-year-old girl kept signaling for help, but no one noticed, except for a former soldier. A few minutes later, he stood up. And what he did next left everyone speechless. A fly was trapped against the glass pane, buzzing faintly, over and over, as if knocking on a world it could never reach. The late afternoon sun slanted through the dusty window, revealing streaks from a half-hearted cleaning. Outside, the Kansas highway stretched like a faint pencil line across the land, quiet and still, disturbed only now and then by a passing semi whose engine roar faded quickly behind a stand of elms turning gold with the season. Ethan Walker set his duffel bag down on the worn, leather-covered bench, which had sagged with age. He sat upright, as if his body hadn't yet relearned how to lean back naturally after years of rigid discipline. Even without the uniform, the straight spine and watchful eyes stayed with him, marks of a Marine who had served 18 years, twice deployed straight into combat zones. At the counter, Margaret Chen, a woman of Asian descent in her early 40s, her wavy hair pinned loosely, apron faded from years of use, was carefully wiping down the coffee machine's glass surface. No one in the diner spoke. The silence was deep enough to catch the clatter of the old HVAC unit, rattling and groaning as it strained to keep the warmth inside the aging wooden room. Ethan wasn't hungry, but he ordered a ham sandwich and a cup of black coffee anyway. The way he said "thank you" was barely above a whisper, like if he said it any louder, the past might hear and come back to remind him this wasn't a world where simple things belonged. Kansas had been home once, before his parents were taken in a crash on Highway 54, a slick winter morning that left a 17-year-old boy with a suitcase and an empty house. He left town a week after the funeral, enlisted with just one thought in his head. Staying would drive him crazy. People say time heals, but soldiers don't think like that. They just learn how to keep a wound quiet long enough to keep moving. At the table by the window, an elderly couple was having a late lunch. The man, black with a silver beard, read the paper. The woman, wearing large reading glasses, mouthed softly to herself as she dipped a piece of bread into her soup. Nearby, a little boy about 4, named Leo, judging by how Margaret called to him, ran loops around the chairs, clutching a small plastic toy car. Every time he let out a loud "Vroom!" the old woman just shook her head and smiled with her lips closed, saying nothing. Ethan watched them. He wasn't the kind to let anyone slip past his line of sight. Not out of suspicion, just habit. A deep one. One that let him read the world through the tiniest details. And then he saw her. In the corner, near the glass, behind a dry, brittle cactus in a pot, sat a little girl. 3, maybe 4 years old. Dark skin, curly hair, wearing a pale blue dress. She sat very still, as if glued to the seat, hands resting on her thighs. Her gaze didn't land on anyone directly. It drifted across the room, brushing every face just long enough to see, but not long enough to be noticed. But she was looking for something, for someone who could read what she couldn't say. Across from her sat a man, tall, wearing a grey suit, blonde hair neatly trimmed, eyes pale blue, almost clear. He was reading, a thick book with no visible title. He hadn't touched the child, hadn't spoken a word. All he did was read. And that was what caught Ethan's attention. Nobody takes a 3-year-old out to eat and then buries their nose in a book. Nobody drives down an interstate and just sits there beside a child, like she's carry-on luggage. Ethan turned his coffee cup slowly, his index finger tracing the rim's warmth. He didn't look at the girl again. He didn't need to. He knew in just a few more seconds she would glance his way again. And she did, almost as if on cue. The same motion, only this time, her eyes lingered. And in them, a slight tremble. Just for a moment. From the kitchen, Margaret came out carrying a tray. She set the sandwich in front of him and asked gently, "Need any sugar, hun?" Ethan looked at her. A simple question, but her eyes squinted just a little, like she too sensed something wasn't quite right in the air of the diner. Ethan shook his head and gave a faint smile. Leo ran past again, nearly bumping into the little girl's chair. She flinched. No sound. The man across from her glanced up, just once, but it was enough to stop Leo in his tracks. Ethan turned to look outside. The parking lot was mostly empty. A dark grey SUV was parked near the utility pole by the road. No one inside, but the engine was running. There was a superhero sticker on the rear window, but not the kind kids put up. The kind used to block the view. He stood, walked his coffee cup over to the sink behind the counter, where Margaret was setting out a tray of apple pie. She looked at him. He spoke low. "That little girl, in the corner. You noticed anything?" Margaret glanced over quickly. Years of raising 3 kids flickered behind her eyes. "She's been sitting there a while. Hasn't said a word. I haven't seen her eat, but once or twice I think she was crying, quietly. I couldn't tell why." Ethan nodded. He walked back to his table and sat, this time facing her more directly. And then the girl looked at him, this time directly. Her right hand lifted slowly. She curled it into a fist, then opened it. Once, twice, 3 times. Not dramatic, but not hidden either. A signal, the universal one, SOS in silent form. He knew, and he believed her. No more doubt. When his gaze locked with the little girl's, young Leo accidentally dropped his toy car, which rolled to a stop at the foot of the man in the grey suit standing next to her, Cole. The man looked up, not at Ethan, not at Leo, but at the girl. His eyes were cold. He said nothing, didn't raise his voice. Just one look, sharp and still, was enough to make the girl pull her hand back and hurriedly place it in her lap. Ethan pressed his fingernails hard into his palm until it turned white. Late afternoon in Kansas was starting to turn chilly, but inside, the air was quietly beginning to boil. The girl had given a signal, and the old soldier knew then he couldn't walk away from this place like some passing traveler anymore. Margaret's diner flicked on its yellow lights, just as the last rays of sunlight slipped through the cracks in the shutters. Outside, it wasn't fully dark yet, but the dimming light was enough to draw a line between inside and out, between the cozy little diner and the silent world beyond the glass. Ethan hadn't touched his coffee a second time. He sat still, watching, breaking down every detail like he was on a front line. Cole sat upright, eyes fixed on his phone. His face gave nothing away. He didn't speak, didn't wipe the girl's mouth, didn't bend down to say something kind or coaxing. A stranger sitting next to a lost child might have looked more involved than he did. Lily wasn't eating. Her hands rested in her lap, her eyes on Ethan. She didn't blink for a long time. She didn't look at Cole. The stiffness in her body didn't come from fatigue. It came from fear of being seen. Ethan took a small sip of his coffee, holding the cup, but not lifting it all the way. Questions drifted through his mind, not one of them fully formed, but the feeling was unmistakable. That man wasn't the girl's father. He stood up and walked over to the table. Still calm on the outside, each step steady, neither rushed nor slow. "Excuse me. Hope I'm not interrupting?" Cole looked up. His lips curved into a smile, but his eyes stayed cold. "What do you want?" "I was just wondering, is the girl your niece?" A brief hesitation. "She's my daughter. Is there a problem?" No. Just, she reminds me of my little cousin when she was a kid. Thought she was real sweet and got curious, that's all." Cole gave a faint smile and nodded, but the gesture was too perfect, like it had been programmed to seem friendly. Lily glanced briefly at Ethan. Her hand moved slightly, palm tightening into a fist, then releasing. Once, twice, 3 times. This time, it was slow, deliberate. No room for doubt. Ethan feigned a pause, as if something had just come to mind. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small peppermint candy, placing it on the table. My niece used to love these. Wonder if the little one might too. How about giving her a candy, he added. Strawberry kids usually go for that. He extended his hand toward Lily. The girl looked up, eyes flicking to Cole, then back to the candy. After a brief hesitation, she slowly reached out, her tiny fingers trembling as they touched the edge of the candy. The swat came quick, like a slap. Cole didn't say a word. He swept his hand across the table, striking Lily's wrist, not hard enough to make a loud sound, but just enough force to make that little arm recoil, as if burned. She's allergic. Don't give her anything without asking. His voice was sharp. He stood up straight, put the candy back in his shirt pocket, and looked at Lily. Slowly, deliberately. She didn't cry, but her hands pulled back, curling around the hem of her shirt, gripping tight. An unconscious defensive reflex. Her small shoulders quivered, her eyes lowered, not just in fear, but from a trust that had just cracked. I'm sorry. I didn't know. Cole gave a slight nod, like slamming a door shut. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. A firm, silent signal. The conversation was over. Ethan turned and walked back to his table. His back was straight, but each step seemed heavier than the last. The air in the diner, already quiet, had turned thick, as if someone had dimmed a layer of light. The faint clink of a spoon against a glass, the breeze slipping through the door crack, everything was swallowed by a dreadful silence. Margaret looked over from behind the counter, her brow furrowed. One hand held a towel-wrapped glass, the other pressed flat against the counter, as if trying to steady herself. Ethan sat down, let out a quiet breath, then spoke loud enough for Margaret to hear. Call the police. The sooner the better. Margaret froze for a moment, then gave a small nod. In the corner of the diner, Lily still sat upright, not leaning against the chair, as if she was afraid that if she let herself rest on anything, she might not be able to get back up. The coffee in the cup had gone cold. Ethan didn't drink anymore. He stood up again, walking with steady steps towards the back of the bar, where the light from the ceiling fixture caught the fine layer of dust on the glass surface. Margaret was standing there, motionless. She held an old cloth, its frayed edges coming loose, and slowly wiped a clean glass. The motion was repetitive, but her eyes were fixed on the empty space in front of her, as if trying to convince herself that she was still in control of the bar, still in control of her life. Ethan approached, unhurried. When he was just a step away from the counter, he stopped and placed both hands on the hard wood. He didn't knock, didn't make a sound. He simply rested his hands there, like someone placing a hand on a door, before opening it with words. He bowed his head slightly, voice low. I've confirmed it. The girl signaled again. It wasn't a mistake. Margaret turned toward him, her eyes heavy. She looked at him for a few seconds, unblinking, not asking anything right away, as if reading something in the expression of the old soldier. You're sure? She asked, her voice raspy, but without hesitation. Ethan nodded, eyes steady on her face. I'm a Marine. I've seen combat. That was a distress signal used when a victim can't speak. Short, clear, 3 times. Just like the manual says. Margaret turned her head toward Cole's table. Lily was still sitting there, unmoving, like a piece of furniture set in the wrong place. She watched for a few more seconds, then turned back, speaking very slowly. If I call the police and I'm wrong. Can I be sued? Possibly. But if you don't call, and I'm right, a child might be taken out of the US tonight. Margaret let out a sigh. The hesitation in her eyes was gone. She nodded a small nod, but a heavy one. A nod she would never forget. Follow me. She led Ethan behind the counter, slipping through the wooden door into the back where the cold storage and break room were. The space was narrow, damp, but soundproof enough that no one outside could hear a thing. Margaret took out her phone and dialed a number. The screen lit up with the words, Rachel Monroe, Sheriff. Lifting the phone to her ear, she spoke quickly. Rachel, it's me, Margaret. Cafe at rest stop number 8. I've got an emergency. The woman on the other end didn't sound alarmed, just asked briefly, Is anyone hurt? Not yet. But there's a little girl. About 3 years old. She's with a strange man. Not eating, not talking, no touch. And... Margaret glanced at Ethan. Someone here confirms she's signaling for help. There was a pause on the other end. Then Rachel asked, Who confirms it? Ethan raised his hand and Margaret passed the phone to him. He put it to his ear. My name's Ethan Walker. Former Marine. I can provide my military ID number later. I'm trained to identify non-verbal SOS signals. The girl has signaled twice very clearly. The man hasn't been violent, but he's in complete control. Rachel's voice changed, focused now. No trace of doubt. I need the location and a description. Do you have a license plate? Grey SUV parked out front. Rear window has a sunshade with a superhero sticker. Kansas plates, but I didn't catch the full number. The man's white blonde hair, grey suit. The girl, light brown skin, pale blue dress, around 3 years old, curly hair. Rachel replied, I'm sending units now. Don't let them leave. I'll handle the rest. Click. The call ended. Margaret leaned back against the stainless steel shelf. Her back trembled slightly. I didn't think I'd be doing this today. Neither did I, but I'm glad you did. At the Sedgwick County Sheriff's Office, the desk phone rang. Officer Tommy Reyes had just set a cup of instant noodles on the table when he reached for the receiver. Briggs speaking. We've got an emergency report from rest stop number 8. Possible child abduction. Chief Collins wants you with the rapid response team. Another false alarm, huh? That's the third one this week. The witness is a former Marine, specially trained. This isn't one of those I heard a strange cry situations. Go, Tommy. Tommy shrugged on his jacket, muttering, Let's just hope it's not another one of those nosy old folks who can't mind their own business. He slid his gun into the holster, checked his flashlight, then got into the patrol car. The red strobe lights flicked on. Back to Margaret's diner. Ethan and Margaret stepped out of the break room. No one in the diner had any idea what had just happened. No one noticed that the world had shifted, just a little. Cole was still sitting there, but his eyes had slid toward the counter. He was clearly more alert. The way he flicked his gaze without turning his head, sweeping the room with just his eyes, was the kind of tell only someone expecting to be followed would show. Lily was still sitting upright, but from behind the counter, Ethan noticed her glancing out the front window, like she was waiting for something to happen. Margaret's cafe, around 8 in the evening. There weren't many customers left. A draft slipped in through the narrow gap at the bottom of the glass door, carrying a chill that made the curtains flutter now and then, like a weary breath. The warm yellow light from the ceiling spilled over the dark wooden tables, casting patches of light and shadow across the floor like the set of a silent play. Ethan was still sitting there, hands resting on the table, his coffee long gone cold. Every sense in his body was drawn taut like a bowstring. Lily sat at the opposite table, hands pulled close into her lap, her eyes flicking toward him every so often. Cole remained the same, controlled, rigid, cold. The sound of the door latch clicked. It wasn't loud, but in the hush of that moment, it sliced through the air like a blade across still water. As the door cracked open, Cole shot to his feet, shoving the chair back abruptly. He grabbed Lily's wrist with enough force to leave the child's skin tinged red. "Let's go," he said quietly, just above a whisper, but there was nothing polite left in his voice. The words came out like an order. Lily gave a slight jerk, her small feet moving reluctantly. She didn't scream, didn't struggle, but her face showed pure alarm. She looked back, her eyes sweeping across the table, where Ethan sat, that same pleading look she'd given before. Only now it was sharper, more urgent. Ethan placed a hand on the table, slid the coffee cup aside, and stood. Not in a rush, not drawing attention, but every step had purpose, moving directly to block the path from Cole's table to the door. The space between them was barely 10 feet. The two men faced each other, the overhead light casting long shadows across the tiled floor. Neither spoke right away. They didn't need to. The air between them was pulled so tight, it felt like it might snap. "Where do you think you're taking her?" Ethan asked. His voice was low, steady, not loud, but impossible to ignore. Cole raised an eyebrow slightly, lips curling into a strained smile. "I told you we're heading back to Iowa. It's late. You're not planning on getting in my way, are you?" Lily lowered her head, but her eyes stayed fixed on Ethan. Her small hands clenched the hem of her shirt, trembling with each beat. Ethan didn't move. "She doesn't want to go with you," he said. "I've called the police. They'll be here soon. If you leave now, it'll look suspicious. Things will go worse for you." Cole let out a short, scornful laugh, shaking his head slightly, like he was listening to something absurd. "Over a piece of candy? A glance? Who do you think you are, butting into someone else's business?" "I'm not sure who I am," Ethan replied, "but I know she didn't go with you willingly. She gave a distress signal. Twice. I saw it. I've been trained to recognize those signs." Cole frowned. He shifted his stance and pulled Lily closer. His grip tightened, making her let out a faint whimper. "You're accusing me in public. I could sue you for interference with personal liberty." Ethan stepped forward, just half a step. It wasn't a threat, but it blocked the way completely. "The police will sort that out. Until they arrive, I'm not letting you leave with her." Cole's eyes narrowed, then without warning, he thrust his arm out as if to shove Ethan aside. But Ethan had been in combat. His reflexes were sharp, steady. He didn't back off or block, just angled his body slightly, maintaining his stance. "Step aside," Cole growled, his eyes now bloodshot, breath turning ragged. Ethan said nothing, but his gaze held steady quiet, cold as tempered steel. Cole was losing patience. He yanked Lily toward the door, but she resisted, bracing her feet against the floor. He jerked her again, rougher this time. For a split second, his other hand drew back, as if ready to strike, but Ethan caught his wrist in midair, gripping it firmly. "That's enough." Ethan's voice was low but carried weight. Cole struggled, trying to pull free. The two men stood nearly chest to chest, breath mingling, tension wound tight like a coiled spring. Cole made another attempt to shove Ethan, but Ethan didn't budge, feet planted like bedrock. Lily backed away, shaking. Her hands clutched the hem of her coat, eyes wide open. "You'll regret this," Cole hissed, his voice low like a curse. The tendons in his wrist stood out beneath pale skin. Ethan still said nothing. He looked Cole straight in the eye, unwavering. Then he bent slightly, his gaze softening as he turned to Lily. "You don't have to go anywhere. You're safe here." Lily didn't move, perfectly still, as if waiting for something to end the way she hadn't dared hope it would. No one had time to say anything more. A siren wailed in the distance. Headlights flickered across the floor through the front window. Blue, red, blue, red. A police SUV rolled to a stop just outside the cafe. The lights slowed. The engine cut off. A car door opened. Tommy Briggs stepped out first. His coat was unbuttoned, one hand resting casually on the holster at his side. He didn't draw his weapon, but every step he took was measured. Behind him came Rachel Monroe, the police chief, calm, composed, commanding. She scanned the scene through the glass, where Ethan and Cole still stood, like two pillars rooted deep in the floor. Cole yanked Lily's hand, trying to turn and pull her away faster. But he had barely pivoted halfway when Ethan took another step forward, planting himself squarely in front of the door. He didn't tense up, didn't say a word, but his broad soldier's back stood like a wall. "Stop right there," Rachel signaled with a hand, her voice clear, not loud, but firm. Tommy stepped in closer, his hand extended in a gesture of peace. "We just need a few minutes. Don't make this more complicated than it has to be." Cole hesitated. He turned to Ethan, eyes burning with fury, his lips moving just enough to mouth, "You're going to regret this?" Ethan said nothing. Instead, he lowered his head slightly, his eyes meeting Lily's. He gave her a small nod. Slow, silent, like a promise. Lily didn't say anything, but she let go of Cole's sleeve and stepped back. Just one step, but enough for everyone to see. Tommy bent down, whispered something gently to Lily, then held out his hand. She stared at it for a few seconds, then took it. She didn't cry, but in her eyes was a light faint, but unmistakable, the kind only survivors carry. Trust, even if fragile. Cole was separated from the girl and taken outside. Rachel kept her eyes on him until he disappeared behind the car door. Inside, Margaret's diner had gone completely still. Ethan walked back to the table and sat down. His whole body seemed to loosen, like a man coming off a chase no one had run. Margaret stepped out from behind the counter. She set a glass of water in front of him. "I never thought I'd do something like that, but today seems like a day to do the right thing." Ethan took the glass, looking at the soft mist clinging to the rim. He didn't drink, just laid his hand flat on the table, as if confirming that a new chapter had just begun. The thing is, doing the right thing doesn't always come at the right time. Margaret let out a long breath. She sat down on the stool behind the counter and looked out the front window where the red and blue lights of the police cruiser still flickered across the wet asphalt. But today at least, we didn't lose the trail. Outside, the wind kept blowing. But this time it didn't feel quite so cold. The late-day breeze swept across the parking lot, carrying with it the dry scent of dust and the familiar tang of old gasoline. Overhead, wispy clouds, thin as smoke, drifted quietly behind the line of trees along the highway. The police had turned off their lights. Cole was led to cruiser number 402, hands cuffed, head lowered. He didn't resist, didn't shout. He just quietly turned his head toward his SUV, as if trying to memorize the direction he never got the chance to run. Tommy glanced at his phone. His eyes flickered when he saw an urgent alert from federal headquarters. 2 men from Cole's group were stopped at the southern border. Texas police confirmed they were waiting for Cole. Possible accomplices. All 3 are suspected of being involved in a child trafficking ring. Rachel gave a slight nod, her hand tightening around the case file. Ethan stood on the other side of the car. No one called to him, but everyone was looking at him. A few bystanders still lingered near the cafe, whispering among themselves. Some took photos, others looked surprised, even moved. A young woman with dyed purple hair, holding her phone like a weapon, was live streaming on TikTok from her car, camera pointed at the police, speaking with excitement in her voice. "See? Told you. That man is clearly not her dad." This is a broad daylight kidnapping in Wichita. Follow me for updates. But not everyone was chasing the story. A middle-aged woman in business attire, a document bag in hand, walked up to Rachel. I was sitting at the back table. I saw everything. That man didn't act like the girl's father at all. He pulled her like she was a sack of goods. And she pulled back. That's not how a child acts with family. Rachel nodded, her gaze heavy but resolute. She signaled to Tommy to take the statement. Lily sat quietly on the back seat of the police car. The door was still ajar. A small cream-colored jacket had been draped over her shoulders by one of the officers, oversized and swallowing most of her little frame. She stared out through the window. Then the door swung open. No one motioned to her. No one called her name. But Lily stepped out. She walked slowly, each small step across the rough concrete, seeming guided only by instinct, drawn toward the one person she believed had kept her alive. Ethan didn't move. He didn't open his arms. He only tilted his head slightly when she stopped in front of him. Lily looked up at him, eyes unblinking. "You're my hero." Her voice was soft, trembling, but clear. A moment later, Lily threw her arms around Ethan, her short reach circling his waist in a tight embrace. Ethan froze. He had never been hugged like that before. It wasn't polite or formal. It was the kind of hug someone gives when they're holding on for dear life, as if letting go would mean falling back into a bottomless pit. His arms lifted, slowly, then rested gently across her back. There was nothing else that needed to be said. From a distance, Margaret stood in the doorway of the diner, arms crossed, her gaze steady. She didn't smile broadly, but her eyes held warmth. She didn't step out or break the moment. She just nodded once, a small nod, as if something right had been completed, and there was no need for recognition. Rachel walked up to Ethan and stopped beside him. "You didn't just save a little girl, Ethan," she said softly. "You reminded the rest of us why we do this job." Ethan didn't answer. He kept looking down at Lily's curly hair, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breath against his shirt. Tommy, the young officer, approached without a notepad or a guarded expression. He stood still for a few seconds, then spoke softly. "Sorry for doubting you at first." Ethan looked at him. In those eyes, for the first time in years, there was a kind of unspoken connection. A quiet recognition between a man who had brushed against death and one still learning how to protect life. He nodded. Lily loosened her grip around him. She looked up at him, then turned to Rachel like a bird realizing it had finally reached the shore. "Where are your parents?" Ethan asked. "My mum's on her way." The girl replied quietly. "Okay. Then I'll stay here until she gets here. You're not going anywhere?" Ethan looked up at the sky. "Not tonight." The police car lights flashed again as the cruiser carrying coal pulled away, rolling slowly through a light layer of dust, sirens silent. But Rachel glanced at her phone and turned to Tommy. "Send a copy of the file to Oklahoma right away. If those two really were waiting for him at the border, we might be able to take down an entire ring." Tommy nodded. His eyes had changed no more doubt, only resolve. Ethan turned back toward the diner. The lights inside were still on. Margaret was still standing there. He walked slowly toward the door. "Mind if I ask for a fresh cup of coffee?" Ethan asked. "Coffee's gone cold, but I've got ginger tea," Margaret replied, reaching out to open the door. "Sounds better. Anyway." Margaret placed 2 cookies on the counter. She spoke softly. "They're Lily's. I used to think I shouldn't get involved in strangers' business, but today, if I don't speak up, then who will?" Ethan didn't respond right away. He looked out of the window, where Lily was being walked to the patrol car by Tommy, still clutching her cream-colored coat. Sometimes, a hug is all it takes to change everything. That night, the wind still blew cold across the highway. But something had been mended, not with a gun, not with violence, but with the small embrace of a 3-year-old girl. A rare, quiet night. But the truth never ends in a single afternoon. Things were only just beginning. The night wind in Wichita carried the scent of cold earth. A light rain had just passed through, leaving the pavement slick with water and the air damp with moisture. Inside the central police station, the fluorescent lights cast a pale glow, spreading faint greenish streaks across the old tile floor. Ethan sat alone in the small waiting room, on a hard plastic chair that creaked every time he shifted his weight. His left hand was lightly streaked with blood from a small scrape on his wrist, something no one had noticed, not even him, until his fingertip brushed it. He stared at it for a moment. He didn't bandage it, didn't complain. To him, real pain didn't live in the flesh. Through the frosted glass, Ethan could see the interrogation room light still on. Rachel was inside with Tommy and a social worker, going over notes about Cole. The door to the temporary medical room opened briefly, then shut again. A female doctor led Lily inside. The girl was still clutching a piece of candy, now melted into a sticky blot inside its foil wrapper. No one had the heart to take it from her. Ethan couldn't hear the voices, but he saw the eyes. The girl wasn't trembling anymore, but her gaze was still the same, lost, wary, like she expected everyone around her might disappear at any moment, including herself. Margaret brought him a cup of coffee. It smelled weak, watered down. She said nothing, just placed it beside him and sat down. For the first time, her hands did nothing. They simply rested on her lap. The silence between them felt like its own language, one that needed no translation. "Rachel says the girl hasn't spoken," she said. Ethan nodded. "And Cole?" Tight-lipped. But his record's not clean. Accused of abuse before. Never convicted. Ethan didn't react. That didn't matter as much anymore. Not now that Lily was here, alive. The waiting room door swung open. Tommy stepped in, followed by a young woman. Her long hair was disheveled. Her coat hung open, her face pale like someone who'd just outrun a storm. Her eyes were red, but there was a strange brightness in them, like someone who had just touched a long-lost piece of their soul. "Grace," Tommy said softly. No need for more. Ethan stood up. Grace looked around, slightly dazed. Then she stopped when she saw Margaret. The two women recognized each other like people who'd once crossed paths during hard, uncertain days. "Where's the girl?" Grace asked, her voice hoarse. Rachel walked over and spoke softly. "In the exam room. She's been checked. No external injuries. But..." Grace didn't wait to hear the rest. She moved quickly toward the room, her hands trembling slightly. Rachel started to stop her, then just sighed and let her go. The door swung open. Grace stood at the threshold. "Lily? It's Mommy!" The little girl sat on a high chair, wearing a coat with sleeves too long for her. Her legs swung, not reaching the floor. She turned when she heard the voice, but she didn't run over, didn't rush into her arms. She just looked. Her eyes were cold, detached, as if she didn't remember. Grace froze. Her voice cracked. "Don't you recognize me, sweetheart? It's me, Lily. I'm here now." Lily clutched the stuffed animal tightly in her hands. She looked at Grace, then turned her head away. A quiet, but unmistakable refusal. In that moment, the embrace never came. Grace stood still, shoulders trembling. She pressed her hand to her mouth, biting down. Tommy stepped in, gently guiding her to another chair. Rachel turned to Ethan. "Saving someone is one thing. Mending them, that's something else entirely." Ethan just nodded. He watched Grace. In that moment, he saw it clearly. Grace wasn't just a mother. She was a survivor. She had endured wounds even deeper than a child's. Was she one of Cole's victims? Ethan asked, his voice rough. Rachel nodded. They lived together for nearly 2 years. He had complete control over her. She tried to run once, but he forced her back. After that, she lost contact with her family and... Margaret added in a low voice, Grace came to my diner once, almost a year ago. She was pregnant then. I thought she was trying to run away, but she came back. I didn't do anything. No one said a word after that. The silence was no longer empty. It had become a witness. Ethan walked to the door, his hand resting on the doorknob. It looked like he was going to leave, but his hand didn't turn it. In that pause, Lily looked up and watched him. No one spoke, but in that moment, something had begun to shift. Down the hallway, in a room where the light hadn't been turned on, there was a file bag no one had opened yet. Inside was a fax from Iowa, an old, out-of-state arrest warrant for Cole that had never made it to Wichita, and a handwritten statement ink, smudged from Lily's biological father, never signed. It all seemed like it had just ended, but in truth, it was only the beginning. 2 days after Lily's rescue, the courthouse in Wichita took on an unusual air. Outside, clusters of reporters jostled for position, cameras perched on shoulders, their lights sharp and probing like needles, aimed at anyone who stepped through the large wooden doors. The buzz had long crossed the borders of the town. Online, sensational headlines rotated non-stop. Hero saves little girl. Mysterious Kansas kidnapping. The hidden truth behind a single-parent home. Ethan walked slowly into the courthouse, an old coat draped over his shoulders, eyes heavy with thought. He hadn't cut his hair, hadn't spoken to the press, hadn't offered a single smile. People nearby snapped photos. Someone tried to thrust a microphone toward him. Ethan said nothing. He simply walked straight ahead. Rachel and Tommy were already seated, nodding slightly as he slipped into the witness row. Cole emerged from the side door, hands cuffed, though still dressed in a neatly pressed suit. His face betrayed no emotion. His eyes swept over the room, pausing just slightly longer when they reached Ethan. He held his chin high, as if this were just another meeting, not a courtroom judgment. Cole's defense attorney was a middle-aged man named Scott Renner, seasoned, self-assured, and well-versed in the art of turning words into reversals. In his opening statement, he leaned into the narrative. Your Honor, my client is the victim of a profound misunderstanding. This is a family matter, one between a stepfather and a stepchild he loved deeply, but whose actions were misinterpreted during a difficult transition. The media has distorted this into a criminal case that never needed to exist. The prosecution didn't respond. They knew appeals, like this often stirred sympathy, but they also had evidence. Grace was called to the stand. She wore a plain white blouse, her hair pulled back, face pale, but her eyes didn't waver. For the first time, she stood before the public and spoke every detail. He didn't just control what I did. He cut off my phone, wouldn't let me work, wouldn't let me see anyone. He hit me while I was pregnant. Once, he locked me in a dark room for 2 days, just because I asked who he was talking to on the phone. The courtroom went silent. The only sound was the steady clack of the court reporter's typewriter. Attorney Renner tried to push back. But you continued to live with him for a long time after the so-called abuse incidents. Grace replied, neither angry nor afraid. I stayed because I was scared, and because I thought if I endured it, he'd leave my daughter alone. The courtroom fell silent. Tommy stepped forward next, presenting a video clip from a highway gas station camera. The footage showed Cole pulling Lily into the car, his eyes scanning the area as if to avoid being recognized. There were no words in the video, but the expressions needed no translation. Ethan was called last. He stood up, his voice slow and steady. I didn't act on a whim. When I saw that little girl signal SOS, I knew it wasn't a game. She didn't hug him. She didn't call him Dad. When I handed her a piece of candy, he slapped her hand away. That's control, not something a normal father does. Attorney Renner asked, "Are you a child psychology expert, Mr. Nolan?" Ethan answered, "No, but I've been on the battlefield. I've seen the look in someone's eyes when they're begging for help, but too scared to speak. That little girl had that look. The truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand its ground." Late that morning, Rachel stepped forward, carrying a small bag. She pulled out a crayon drawing. It showed a little brown-haired girl holding a red candy with a dark-clothed man pulling her by the arm from behind. She placed the drawing in front of the court and said, "Lily didn't say anything to us, but this is how she told her story." No one could argue with that image. It was chilling in its honesty. Scott Renner stood up, trying to regain control. A child's drawing can't be used as legal evidence. Rachel replied, "But it's evidence of fear, and fear doesn't lie." At that moment, the prosecution presented another file. Tommy slid a bundle of documents from the state of Texas and an old handwritten letter from a man named Robert Callahan Lily's biological father toward the judge. In the letter, Mr. Callahan had pleaded for custody of Lily 3 years ago, but never received a response. Alongside it was a report from the Federal Bureau of Investigation confirming that Cole had once been under surveillance on suspicion of involvement in an interstate child trafficking ring. An unexpected witness stepped forward, Tabby, the girl who had live-streamed on TikTok the day of the incident. She approached with her phone in hand, bringing forward a video she had recorded of Ethan confronting Cole. "I used to think I was just filming for fun," she said, "but when I watched it again, I saw the look in that little girl's eyes. I'm sorry I tried to sensationalize it at first, but now I know I have to tell the truth." The video was played in the courtroom. It showed Cole yanking Lily by the arm, and Ethan's voice, "I've called the police. They're on their way." The court ordered Cole to be held without bail, and the case file was handed over for further investigation. As he was led away, his defiant gaze was gone. Down below, Grace gripped her hands tightly. Ethan no longer looked at him. His eyes were on Lily, seated in the back row, her face still solemn, but no longer avoiding his gaze. A reporter came up to Ethan and asked, "How do you feel about being called a hero?" Ethan looked at the man for a moment, then said, "I'm not a hero. I just couldn't look the other way." And then he turned and walked off. Behind him, Rachel was staring at Lily's drawing again, eyes fixed. She knew this wasn't just a case, it was part of something bigger, something still hiding in the dark, and they had only just brushed the surface. Night in Wichita had a kind of false quiet. The yellow streetlights filtered through the faded white curtains, casting soft shadows across the worn floor of the modest room. The wall clock ticked gently, as if marking time for something left unsaid. Outside, the wind hissed across the empty parking lot, carrying with it the dry rustle of litter and dead leaves. Ethan leaned back against the chair, an unopened beer bottle resting on the table, his eyes quietly fixed on the envelope in his hand. There was no perfume, no decoration, just a careful, slanted script that read, "To Mr. Ethan Walker." He opened it. In the rustle of paper was everything someone hadn't dared to say out loud. "Dear Mr. Nolan, I don't know where to begin, just like I don't know how to look you in the eye and say all of this. So, I'm writing instead. Thank you for saving the girl. But thank you isn't enough. You didn't just save Lily. You made me believe that there are still people in this world who will stop, listen, and do something. I once thought about leaving her behind, not because I didn't love her, but because I believed that if I disappeared, Cole would have no reason to hurt her anymore. I thought that over and over, on those nights when he was drunk, breaking down the bedroom door, standing over us with a knife. I had a chance to run. I even made it to Iowa with Lily. But my own mother told me, without papers, without a lawyer, no one would believe me. So I came back. That return nearly killed me. The drawing Lily made, I didn't know she still remembered so clearly. She never spoke of it, but she drew everything. What you saw was real, and I believe you saw it before anyone else even began to understand. Thank you. From a once desperate mother. Grace. Ethan folded the letter, his hand tightening slightly. There was a knock at the door. He stood and opened it. A man in his early 30s stood there, tall, solid build, brown hair streaked with a few strands of grey at the temples. He extended his hand. "I'm Jake Whitman. I'm Grace's fiancé and Lily's legal stepfather." Ethan shook his hand. The grip was firm but not excessive. No lengthy introductions, no searching looks. The two men simply stood there, looking at each other, as if already grasping the outline of a story left unfinished. They sat down. Paul brought 2 beers. He cracked the caps and handed one to Ethan. "She couldn't say all the thank yous you deserve, neither can I. But I think some things are worth sharing if we keep them bottled up, they fester." Ethan nodded. They clinked their bottles. A few minutes passed in silence, filled only by the wind and the faint buzz of the hallway's neon light. Paul spoke. "I met Grace after she ran from Cole. She was staying at a women's shelter. I was volunteering there, teaching basic car repair. She had Lily with her. The girl was barely 2, wouldn't talk, wouldn't smile, but she'd just stand and watch me work on engines. I never figured out why." Ethan didn't ask. He just listened. When Grace got served with court papers demanding visitation rights for Cole, she nearly fell apart. We hired a lawyer, but the laws in Kansas, they're not always on the mother's side, especially not when the mother once ran. Paul reached into his pocket, pulled out a thin file, and slid it across the table to Ethan. "This is a copy of the emergency protection order we filed last year. Denied. Reason: no new evidence. The system isn't wrong, but it's not fast enough." Ethan opened it. His eyes stopped at a handwritten note in the margin. It was Grace's. "If I die, please someone take care of Lily." He closed the file. Said nothing. Paul continued, "I know you're not trying to be a hero, but your silence, it says a lot. Someone has to take the hit so others can be safe. Grace and I owe you for that." Ethan finished his beer, set the bottle down. His eyes drifted toward the window, where the streetlight cast long, slanted streaks of yellow across the room. He spoke slowly. "I lost both my parents in a car crash when I was 17. After that, I stayed with relatives on my mother's side for a while, but things were never the same. That's why I enlisted early. In the service, I learned how to endure, how to stay silent and carry loss. But nights like this..." He looked out the window again, his voice dipping lower. "They still take me back to that hollow feeling when I got the call that my parents weren't coming home. That's when I understood some things. If you don't hold on to them in time, they're gone forever." Paul didn't say anything right away. He took a sip of beer, then said quietly, "Meeting Lily felt like getting a second chance to do something right. But that chance didn't come from nowhere. It came from Grace. She chose to believe in me, after everything men had put her through." He paused, his eyes settling into a dark corner of the room. "Some scars never heal, but at the very least, if we don't run, they won't spread." Then the two men fell silent. They just sat there, like two people holding on to something that had once been lost. Behind them, Grace's letter lay still on the table, beneath the soft lamp glow. Beneath the dried ink was a pain once thought to be buried for good. And outside the window, the wind kept blowing. But this time, it didn't feel quite as cold. A week after the trial, Wichita had settled back into its usual quiet. Autumn leaves drifted down along the winding paths of the small park behind the local preschool. Children's laughter echoed once more, not too loud, not too soft, just enough to make people forget what had happened. Ethan sat on an old wooden bench, one hand resting on a neatly packed backpack. He'd checked out of his motel, withdrawn cash from the bank, and planned to head out the next morning. Where to he hadn't decided. He only knew he had to leave this place, the town he'd stumbled into by chance, only to be held back by something no one could have predicted. A small pair of eyes and a desperate, signaling hand. A light breeze brushed through his graying hair. Ethan lowered his head and flipped through a few pages of his worn leather notebook, scribbling down scattered lines, no addresses, no plans, just unanswered questions. A soft sound made him look up. At some point, Lily had settled onto the bench beside him. No one had called her. No one had brought her. She wore an old beige coat with frayed cuffs, her hair loosely tied and slipping off to one side. She didn't speak, didn't look at him, just rested her tiny hands on her knees, eyes fixed on the little pond in front of them. Ethan thought to say something, but stopped. They simply sat there, neither disturbing the other. A duck floated quietly across the water, catching the last of the afternoon's sun. Lily turned her head. Her dark brown eyes were wary, but not afraid. She held out her hand. In her small palm was a red piece of candy, slightly misshapen from having been held for a long time. Ethan looked at it, then took it. He didn't unwrap the candy, just held it gently in his palm. "Can you fly?" Lily's voice was as soft as wind brushing through tree branches, but clear enough to make an adult's heart skip a beat. Ethan shook his head gently. "No, but that day I was fast enough to catch you." Lily nodded. She didn't beam, didn't rush into a hug, but the corners of her mouth lifted ever so slightly, a sign. The first since that day. A child's nod, sometimes it carries more weight than 1,000 comforting words. A short distance away, Grace and Paul stood beneath the maple tree, just a few dozen steps off. They didn't step in, didn't call out. Grace smiled and reached for Paul's hand. They stayed still, letting the moment belong solely to the two on the bench. Ethan watched Lily for a long time, then turned to the lake. The candy in his hand was no longer just a sweet treat. It was a thank you, a bridge, a thread tying together two hearts that once seemed lost to each other. He slipped the candy into his coat pocket without saying a word. But something inside him softened as if, for the first time in years, he no longer felt like an outsider. Above them, the clouds drifted apart, light as air. Early winter in Wichita felt different. It wasn't the biting cold of the military, nor the damp chill of night marches through unfamiliar terrain. Here, the wind carried the scent of something beginning. The newly built shelter for abused children sat tucked between aging houses, its walls painted white, roof covered with red shingles. At the front gate hung a neatly placed wooden sign, "Red Flame Shelter." The red letters had been painted by a child's hand, careful, clumsy, but full of life. Ethan stood in front of the sign, hands buried in the pockets of his faded khaki coat. His eyes locked onto the lettering, as if he were trying to read something hidden beneath each brush stroke. Each red stroke brought back a moment from that afternoon he'd stepped into Margaret's coffee shop, to the second that tiny hand had reached out with a red candy, trembling, but full of trust. A familiar voice came from behind him. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Margaret came up with the name. Lily chose the color. Rachel Monroe stood there, wearing a grey wool coat, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand. Her usually stern face had softened. A breeze swept past, carrying with it the scent of fresh-cut lumber and the quiet smile of a woman who had once faced down the hardest verdicts. Ethan didn't turn around. He just nodded. "I didn't think I'd ever come back here. But here you are. That's the difference, Ethan." Rachel stepped up beside him, her voice unhurried. "We want you to stay, as the center's security advisor, not as a soldier, as a gatekeeper. Some of these kids, they can only sleep through the night if they know someone's out there watching the door." Ethan frowned. He had never thought about settling down. He used to be the kind of man who walked away the moment the mission was done. But this time, his heart didn't feel as light as it used to. He looked out across the yard, where a group of kids were playing tag. A little boy sat by the slide, holding a plastic dinosaur with its head broken off. He wasn't crying, just watching, as if waiting for someone to fix it for him. "I don't think I'm good with kids," Ethan said quietly. Rachel smiled. "You don't have to be. You just have to show up." The door on the right side of the center swung open. Lily came running out, her pigtails bouncing. She wore a deep red coat, and the scarf around her neck hung loose, embroidered with her name. When she saw Ethan, she stopped, then slowly walked over. She didn't say a word, just simply reached out and took his hand. Ethan looked down. Her small fingers curled around his, cold but firm. She didn't look up, but her little feet were pointed toward the doorway, an unspoken invitation. He glanced at Rachel, as if asking for confirmation. Rachel nodded. No other reason was needed. Inside the center, the hallway still smelled of fresh paint. The walls were lined with children's drawings, houses, sons, moms, dads, puppies, and in the center of it all was one picture that stood out. In it, a man in a green military uniform had his arm around a brown-haired girl. She held a red candy in her hand, and sunlight, drawn with wax crayons, spilled over the top of their heads. Ethan stopped in front of the painting. He didn't need to ask who had drawn it. He knew. Paul and Grace stood at the end of the hallway, along with Margaret and Tommy. Each of them looked at him differently, admiration, gratitude, quiet relief. But no one stepped in. They understood. This moment didn't belong to words. He turned back to Lily, leaned down, and asked softly, "Is it okay if I just stay for a little while?" The girl nodded. "As long as you need. Just don't disappear." Ethan let out a quiet laugh. For the first time in years, it wasn't a laugh born of sarcasm or politeness. It came from something quietly melting inside him. Rachel stepped forward and laid a hand on his shoulder. "Told you soldiers never stop serving. They just change where they stand." Ethan looked around. He saw kids drawing, a little girl still sniffling while a volunteer comforted her. He saw Margaret handing a cookie to a boy. Tommy crouched down, fixing a crooked rug. No one barked orders, no one shouted, but they were all doing the same thing, keeping the children safe. He nodded. "All right, but just for a little while." Lily gripped his hand tighter, as if she already knew that little while would last longer than anyone thought. Outside, the early winter sunlight fell softly on the red-tiled roof. It's over, but not truly the end. Maybe today's story makes us realize, sometimes, just a glance, a small nod, or even a tiny piece of candy can be a silent cry for help in a noisy world. Courage doesn't always roar. It lives in quiet acts by those who choose not to look away. Have you ever asked yourself, if it were you in that cafe that day, would you have been perceptive enough to notice a child's silent signal? Do you believe justice could come from a video accidentally recorded? Or have you ever missed a sign, one that still lingers in your heart with quiet regret? This story isn't just for telling, it's a reminder. that we don't live only for ourselves, but also for the eyes quietly hoping we'll see them. If you're watching this on a weary day, I hope you're doing okay.